Hi everybody, I'm having some camera issues. Tahnee,
Hello.
you can hear me, but you can't see me, right?
No,
Hold on.
I can just see the logo.
Yeah, and it won't let me turn it off. Um,
Do you have Skype open or another Zoom meeting open?
I see. You know what?
Sometimes if you do have that, then your camera is on somewhere else.
I always say it's great working with. It's always great working with smart people, and Tahnee saves my ass on a number of occasions, and you just saw one of them. Hi everybody, but Tahnee is hosting the meeting, so I'm gonna hand over things to her.
Perfect. So hello everybody. It's good to see some of you again and some of you for the first time. Hi Perry, Michael, Eric, Disnad, Jennifer, welcome.
Yeah, hi.
Looks like somebody is connecting to audio still, and then we have Gabby over there. So Eddy, do you want to start recording right away? Oh, you're recording already. All right, perfect.
Yeah.
So welcome to our fourth webinar of the series this year. It will be about assessment literacy and being assessment literate. And we welcome Eddy again to present to us today. And I'm really looking forward to his presentation, and I'm happy to have him with us again today for this webinar. Our sponsor does not wish to be identified, but thank you to our anonymous sponsor for today's webinar. It's much appreciated. And so I will now hand it over to Eddy, so he has the full hour with us.
Okay. Hi everybody. Thanks for coming. I've seen some of you recently, others not so. So I was thinking earlier. I mean, it's since I last spoke to you, maybe my role at the University of Arizona kind of changed. That I'm no longer the assessment coordinator. I was in that position at the English Center for I guess about 9 years. But I ended up changing to a different department at the university. So my assessment stuff has kind of changed. Not too much involved with classroom assessment in ESL EFL, but of course I'm still teaching classes and still dealing with the same issues. Kind of today we'll focus a little bit on classroom assessment. I'm talking about being assessment literate. I guess one thing I was thinking about this earlier, and see what you think, that in terms of so I mean, two primary areas of assessment, whether it's classroom assessment or large-scale language testing. And when you talk about large-scale language testing, I mean, you're getting into areas of psychometrics, educational measurement, right? And I guess that, you know, in particular, you're getting into those areas. So, and I'm not sure, but I don't think I see the term assessment literacy associated so much with that area. Typically, it's used and referred to and talked about in terms of what happens in the classroom. And you may have heard me mention this before, that I mean, classroom assessment comes out of mainstream K-12 education in the United States, particularly in the 1990s and 2000. And then, like so many things, what happens in mainstream education, at least sometimes, washes over into our particular area of ESL and EFL. One more thing to tell you about myself and Tahnee. I think we're kind of involved in something unique, because at the University of Arizona, we developed and administer an English proficiency test. So if you and we lobbied the undergraduate school and also the grad school to accept our tests. So if you go to a webpage now, you'll see TOEFL and IELTS, and then our in-house English proficiency test. Which, Tahnee, it just occurred to me, I mean, I guess it's kind of unique in terms of universities and schools around the country. I mean, you know, usually you don't get schools that develop their own tests. So I guess I'm reminding you that I'm doing a little bit of both. So okay, let me get into my 185 slides that I'm going to go through. Okay, maybe not that many, but let's see. Let's see. Okay. All right. So nice picture of the University of Arizona here. And I guess, I mean, I'm talking about, you know, of course, being assessment literate, and I guess it's important to me because literally my assessment literacy led directly to my job here at the University of Arizona, without a doubt. It's what I focused on for my doctorate, and you know, what I ended up doing, and it led me directly here. So you may have seen or not, just this article I published like almost about 10 years ago, and I started writing about assessment literacy, and I guess I've been talking about it or involved with it in some ways since then. A plug for the society we have our first virtual conference coming up in October, and the theme for the conference is called Cross Currents. But again, you see these two branches of assessment, whether it's large scale proficiency testing or classroom assessment. I'll talk a little bit about. We'll get into a little bit about proficiency testing, I think, somewhere in some places along the way, but primarily I'm talking about classroom assessment. So I think I have a content slide for you. Yes, what are we doing? I'm going to talk a little bit about what assessment literacy is and how it's practiced. A big part of what we're doing today, I hope, is just getting into a discussion about some different things related to assessment and assessment literacy quiz. Okay. You probably thought you were going to get a quiz somewhere along the way. Well, this is how we're starting. Okay, we're starting right at the moment with a quiz, and it brings us into some assessment literacy territory. Okay, so you ready? I want you to take some notes, mental or otherwise. And the question is, what assessment term is being described in the following items? And I was going to give you the list of terms, but I thought this is an assessment literate crew here. I don't need to give them some of the vocabulary. They already know this stuff, I think. All right, here we go. So what terms are being defined? The availability of clear, accurate information to students about testing. This is number one. Number two refers to the variety of ways of collecting information on a learner's language ability or achievement. Number three refers to a formal systematic procedure used to gather information about a student's behavior. Number four, tests or tasks that determine if students have achieved the objectives set out in the curriculum. Number five is about using test results to improve instruction. So they're given during a course, feedback is provided to the students. This includes the whole course or program, and information is collected from many sources, including the learner. These types of tests are scored by comparing a student's responses with an established set of acceptable or correct responses. And then number 8, this requires scoring by opinion or personal judgment. So the human element is very important. Okay. So you have some ideas about each one of these. I'll skip I'm going to skip the breakout room option that I'm mulling here for a couple of seconds and just see. Okay, I'm going to pick on some people and see if I can get some answers, or maybe you can volunteer. Anybody? What about the first one? Availability of clear, accurate information to students about testing. Any guesses here?
Transparency.
Aha. Okay. What do you think? Is Mike right? Does that sound good? Or is he just trying to impress people? Okay. Okay. What about number 2? Refers to the variety of ways of collecting information on a learner's language ability or achievement. And I guess I'm comparing it with number 3. So number 2 and 3 are kind of connected, but I guess I'm seeing if you can distinguish between the two. Abdul Samad, you have a confident look on your face there.
Yeah, maybe number 2 is evaluation.
Uh-huh. And what about number 3?
Or maybe formative and summative
Aha.
between 2 and 3, but it might not be.
It might be. It might not. It might not be either. Okay. I'm not gonna. I'm gonna. I'll tell you the answers in a minute here, and let's just keep going and see where we go. Number 4, tests are tasks that determine if students have achieved the objectives set out in the curriculum. So you get this. I guess one of the identifying features of classroom assessment is that you get this connection to a curriculum or learning outcomes or something. Number 4. Any guesses here?
I can guess again if nobody else wants to.
Go ahead, Mike.
Achievement testing or achievement.
Okay. Yep. Anybody take a guess at number 6? Including the whole course or program, information is collected from many sources, including the learner. And I guess it's a little bit different from 2 and 3. Okay, let me tell you some of the answers here, and you can kind of score yourselves and see how you did. You're right, Mike. The first one was about transparency. Number 2 and 3, I guess I was trying to make this distinction between assessment, which is a much broader term, and a test. And usually there's some kind of formal systematic instrument that you're using. Assessment could be much broader, of course. Number 4, Mike, you said achievement testing, but yeah, I mean that it's also achievement. It's also achievement testing there. Even achieved is used in the line here. It's also summative assessment and making just that distinction between summative and formative assessment. That was number 4 and 5. The identifying feature with formative assessment is always this focus on feedback. There's feedback to the learner about what to improve or not to improve. Okay. Number 6 is just the issue of evaluation. I guess, I mean, at least when I think of it, and some of the definitions like this one will show this, that evaluation applies more to, you're evaluating a program or a course or even even a center or whatever. It's a much broader type of thing that's going on. For example, you can evaluate your IEP. Is your IEP functioning as it should? One of the things that we ended up doing, for example, at the English Center, is that we used an outside test. We used ITEP, the International Test of English Proficiency, just to see if students were progressing up to our levels. We were testing. It was an evaluation to see if the program was working. Okay. Number 7, objective test. Right, there's an acceptable or correct answer, and the last one you're getting into just subjective tests or subjective element to it, particularly if you've got human raters involved, right? Okay, and 7 is just usually, I mean, often at least some parts of a tester you get this. There's a right or wrong component about it, and it just speaking in terms of whether it's a proficiency test or even classroom testing, when you get people involved in giving scores, usually with a rubric. I mean, so most often you're talking about you're talking about the productive skills, speaking and writing. And usually rubrics are not involved in assessing the receptive skills, so listening and reading. And sometimes I do test reviews where I'm looking at tests, and if I see a rubric that's related to a reading section or a listening section, immediately my warning bells start ringing. Because often, I mean, with those 2 skills, you're assessing comprehension, right? So, I mean, primarily you're assessing comprehension, and usually there's a right or a wrong answer. Right? There might be the possibility of having a rubric, for example, if students have to write a summary. So students have to write a summary about what they heard or about what they read, and then possibly you could have a rubric involved. But usually, listening and reading is just comprehension. Okay, so a few points to make about assessment literacy, and one of the best definitions I like. This is not from EFL or ESL. is this one, and from the book Teacher-Made Assessment. So the ability to create and use valid and reliable assessments as a classroom teacher to facilitate and communicate student learning. I think the key point there also is just to facilitate student learning, because we've talked about this before, that assessment-literate teachers use assessment to push the learning and promote learning. Okay. Rick Stiggins has been writing about assessment literacy for quite a while, and he gives a few more defining features of what assessment literacy involves. So assessment literate teachers come to any assessment knowing what it is that they're assessing, why they're doing so, okay, how best to go about assessing it, how to generate good samples of student performance, because that's, I mean, primarily assessments involve some kind of student performance or test taker performance, right? And so one of our challenges, how do we generate that sample of performance, whether it's through good, for example, presentation prompts or writing prompts. Assessment literate teachers know the things that can go wrong, and they also know how to, you know, they know how to prevent these things before they even happen. So these are some good good defining features of assessment literacy. And I tell teachers and people when I'm talking to them, because people are I mean, there's lots of negative ideas and negative things associated with assessment, and I mean, sometimes teachers think it's just this add-on that's part of the courses and classes, and of course it's much more important than that. But one of the things that catches teachers' attention is that I say assessment literate teachers spend less time doing assessment. They spend less time doing it because they're better decision makers. Assessment literate teachers make better decisions about assessment, about when to do it, et cetera. And they, you know, they make better decisions about rubrics, et cetera. And they just, because of that, I think they spend less time doing it. So I think assessment literacy should be an issue of interest and professional development for all educators, okay? The problem is, again, going back to the Garrison Grant book about teacher-made assessments, numerous studies and surveys report that most teachers are sorely lacking in their knowledge and skills regarding the assessment of student learning. I mean, it's been researched and people identified, and so teachers are lacking in their skills related to assessing student learning, and primarily it's a lot of it's just because background and training, and that sometimes teachers don't get training in doing assessment. Lots of people debate it, but yeah, there isn't any denying that it does exist. Okay, and just a couple of things to remind you about, a few assessment ideas to consider. A couple of these are just from that reading. Improving student learning implies improving the assessment system. Teachers often assume that it's their teaching that directs student learning. And it is, of course, and this is not at all intended to demote teachers, but in practice, it's the assessment that directs student learning, right? So the assessment defines what kind of things is worth learning. Good assessment and grading practices helps teachers improve their instruction, helps students motivate to learn, and it also increases student levels of achievement, okay? And this is my big, beautiful picture. And this is kind of a famous quote from John Cowan. He said, assessment is the engine which drives student learning. And I think there's a lot of, there's certainly a lot of truth to that. Even, I guess, in some ways, if you're a classroom teacher and you're involved with classroom assessment, not necessarily ESL or EFL, then, you know, that's one of the engines that drives learning. So as teachers, we have lots of choices and to make considering assessment. And again, I think assessment literate teachers are just better deciders. They're better decision makers about assessment. And just considering some of the tasks that you use when you assess your students, or the possible things to include, or even for large scale testing, and you have to consider, what kind of tasks am I going to include, right? What kind of tasks do I include in this proficiency test? And so, for example, if somebody says, well, I want to do a different kind of proficiency test, and I don't want to go through the usual list of items, I want to put in some different tasks there. But sometimes those different tasks, and you don't see them in mainstream tests, sometimes for good reason, because sometimes they don't belong there. And just a couple of more points, everybody, and we'll get into some discussion. Any type of assessment, I find it useful to remember this. Two key components to focus on. There's a task, right? There's always a task or a series of tasks, and then there's always some kind of scoring that's going on. And that doesn't matter if it's a 4-hour TOEFL test or a quiz you're doing in the classroom, right? There's some kind of task or scoring going on, and it's something else to consider. Validity and reliability often get mixed up, and there's, well, that's not what I want to say. They often get mixed up. They're very much a part of each other, and sometimes it can be tricky to tease the two apart. But I find that if you're talking about tasks or what students are asked to do on a test, then you're getting into very prime validity territory. So I always associate tasks with validity. What are we assessing with this task? Are we assessing the things that we want to assess? And then scoring gets into issues of reliability. Scoring is about consistency and just consistency of the assessments that you're doing with students. 3 key questions: what is it you're assessing? What tasks do students have to complete? And how is their performance scored? Okay. And just going up on the top, almost the definition of a good test. If you've got good tasks there that work well and you've got a good scoring system in place, then you have a good test on your hands. Or the opposite is true also. You see problems with the task, problems with the scoring system, it's a clear indication of a flawed or faulty test, whether it's a large-scale proficiency test or a classroom one. Okay, oh no, one more part 2, okay? I'm giving you a part 2 of the quiz here. Michael, being a very studious person, I see him reaching for his pencil and notepaper there. So, okay, here's what I'm asking you about this one. How many of the following sentences are false? Which ones? And can you tell me why? Okay, so how many of the following sentences are false? Which ones and why? And I'm just going to throw these up there and let you read them. I think we have 2 more coming. Nine is about practicality. Okay, so remember the question. Now we're looking for a number. How many of these 10 statements, how many are false? And which ones do you think are false? Okay. Throw a number at me. Take a guess. How many do you think are false here? Abdul Samad is showing. Is that a 3 you're showing?
Yes, 3.
3. Jennifer has got 1. Okay. Perry is reading through them again because he's trying to decide whether it's 9 or 10. You're on mute, Perry.
No, I was just saying I'm auditing this class.
Okay, good. All right. Sorry, Perry, to throw you in the middle there. Abdul Samad says 1. No, it's 3. Jennifer says 1. Tahnee, what do you think? Tahnee says 5. Uh-oh. I think I might be in trouble here. Let's see. 1, 2, 3 seem fine. 4, 4 and 6 are mixed up. Okay, you should be, yeah. Number 4 should be validity, and number 6, consistency of scoring. We're talking about reliability. 7, testing research shows that brief quizzes produce more reliable results than longer exams, and vice versa is true. Important point here is that, I mean, that's why you'll get exams that are running for an hour and a half or 2 hours or sometimes longer. And the idea is that, especially with large-scale proficiency tests, that if you have a proficiency test with a series of tasks that are different and are assessing the skills you want to, usually it's an indication of a better test. So if you see a proficiency test, especially if it's talking about anything like getting into a university or anything, and it's a half an hour long or shorter, I mean, you know, there are big issues with that. 8 is true. 9, test security. Yeah, I mean, usually we think about test security with large scale proficiency as the test, but also, you know, if you're doing interviews for a final exam and students walk into the room, they already know what the questions are, that's a test security issue, and your test validity is gone out the window here. 4.
Don't ask me why I had written down 8 too, but I have no idea why I wrote down 8. It is definitely true.
Which one? Which one did you get?
So I had written down 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, but I have no idea why I included 8, because 8 is definitely true.
It's because of all the pressure you're under, I think, Tahnee. So
Yes.
sometimes these things happen. All right, everybody. I guess I wanted to. I was trying to decide whether to include the quiz, and I decided to mix things up, but also the quiz introduces a whole bunch of topics and ideas for us to consider too. Okay, so I just want to get over into just discussion mode and talk to you about some issues, like what questions do you have about assessment, any of the things that we just covered there that you want to get some clarity about. What issues or challenges do you deal with related to assessment? And how does assessment literacy or lack of it impact your work context? Okay, and I know I don't necessarily mean you, but so for example, a related question. Are the deciders about assessment in your context, are they assessment literate? Are the people that are making decisions, do you have confidence in them about that? Okay, so what questions do you have? Any challenges or issues? And how does assessment literacy impact your work? And just thinking of a quick challenge I have with assessment, it's happening, it's an ongoing thing that's happening, and I'll tell you before I forget about it, but I have this issue of, I don't know if you have experience with assessing group projects, and I just started it doing last semester. I did it this semester. Students are working on a group projects where 20% of the grade. Students told 3 students told me yesterday, it's 4 people in the group. One guy is telling me this girl has been AWOL for like a month. We haven't heard anything from her. So they submitted their final report and said her name is not on it. And I talked to them and I said, that's fine. I said, if she hasn't been involved, her name is not on it, I'll go and I'll deal with her. And I sent her an email, and she emailed me back, said, I've been involved here and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh man, it's a bit of a nightmare just trying to deal, not necessarily the project, but just dealing with the students, the interpersonal stuff, right? But now I've kind of got myself in a bit of a situation because I removed her from the group, but she said she's done some work. So now I've got to, I guess I'm not sure if I'm going to have to massage the final grade for her or do something with it, but I've got a week or 2 to figure it out. But that's the kind of stuff that, comes up with assessment, whether you're in language teaching or not. So how about you guys? Questions, issues? Is assessment literacy, how does it affect your work context?
Eddy, I have a question.
Go ahead, Perry.
With respect to, and it may not fit with respect to assessment literacy, but I'm just wondering, you don't talk, you make no reference to feedback to the test taker once the teachers give an assessment test to the students. So
yeah,
what role is that in assessment literacy?
I mean, it's huge, and it's I mean, I'm glad you asked the question, and because there's so many possible things to get into an assessment. But feedback is what is the expression about? Feedback is like fish; it goes off after a week, right? So this idea that feedback, I mean, you have to get feedback to people relatively quickly, especially in a classroom context. In my classes, my students, usually for example, my students are submitting assignments or work, on Monday or Tuesday. Sometimes I can get it back to them by Friday, but the feedback, I mean, it has to be going back to them relatively quickly, and usually if there's some kind of rubric or something that's attached to it. One of the problems that teachers have is giving lots of feedback to students, written feedback, and of course students don't pay attention to it at all, and so sometimes making decisions about how much time should I spend on doing that. So those are some of the feedback issues. Perry, let me ask you a question, because you're coming from the proficiency test side of things, but when students do an ITEP, they do a proficiency test, how long is the typical wait time before they'll get their score results?
24 hours or less.
Really? Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very simple, very similar principle in the idea that a fast turnaround time is kind of important. Yeah. Okay. Good question about feedback, though. It is important. What else, everybody? What issues are you dealing with?
I've got one. I would say with part of my position I was hired to be the testing assessment coordinator, and I wasn't teaching for a long time until the pandemic, where now I direct, I teach, the testing guy, and everything else, pretty much the airline mechanic, etc. But one thing that's come up is, for example, is that trying to separate the skills. If you're testing for listening, but then you touched on this previously, we're testing for listening, for example, but then we ask the student to write a paragraph to summarize what they heard. But then I guess what happened was, before in the past, I had instructors who would send a test to me to give my stamp of approval. And I would say, well, like, what are you trying to test here, though? Because they said I'm testing listening, but it ended up being a paragraph or longer that was written, and then they're scoring and checking for grammar and things like that in the paragraph, and said, you may be testing comprehension of listening, but you're combining this in this case with writing, which is not, I was gonna say it's not valid, it's not reliable. Is on the spot there, right?
It's a good question, Eric, and it's an issue, and it's an issue it's a good example of an issue that applies for classroom testing, and it also applies to large scale proficiency testing. And because one of the things that sometimes people try to do is have an integrated task where you're integrating two skills. So read this and then write about it or whatever. But there's potentially lots of problems with that, because when you integrate tasks and you're trying to assess both two different skills, it becomes very difficult to do that validly and reliably. Okay, so for example, if imagine a writing test, so a couple of options on a writing task on an exam, whether a large scale one or not, is like, okay, here's two writing prompts. I want you to choose one and write about it, and then you put in a word limit or a time or whatever, and that's it. And student picks the topic and they write about it, and you can look at that and go, okay, I'm assessing their writing ability and their writing proficiency. And I think you certainly can do that with that type of task. Okay, now let's choose another task. Okay, here's a reading. It's a newspaper story. Read the story first, and then I'm gonna have a prompt or an opinion I want you to write about. Okay, now my reading proficiency directly impacts my performance on my ability to write something, right? And so lots of people, and I guess me included, would say, if you're testing writing, get rid of that reading stuff and go with that first version. Give them a couple of prompts that they're writing about. So, but it's an issue, and I've seen it recently also in a large scale test, that once you start trying to put and the integrated assessment, one of the things that people, one of the reasons for it is that people think it just makes things more authentic. It makes it more authentic is that usually you read something and talk about it or whatever. And that's true, but what you gain in authenticity is certainly a potential danger that you lose in validity. And I remember when I came to the English Center, all of the classes were mixed together, right? We had speaking, writing, listening, or whatever, and there was actually the names. And one of my first recommendations was to separate the skills. And lots of teachers were angry and pissed off and saying that, that's not what happens in real life. And I said, of course it isn't what happens in real life. But if you're in an IEP and your job is to promote students' proficiency and get them, they're better writers, they're better readers, etc. I made the argument that it makes sense to focus on the separate skills for each class. Now, I was teaching a writing class. What happened in the writing class? Lots of discussion, of course, sometimes reading stuff, that happened too, but it was a class about writing and writing skills, and that's what I assessed, and that's what I kind of focused on. So it's a good question, but it's a challenge. But I guess I would say that focus on, if you're trying to assess a particular skill, focus on that. Right? I had a teacher ask me once, does there have to be a reading on a reading test? Yes, the answer is. And what that teacher was doing, basically the teacher was like, students had to read a novel during the semester. And she was asking them questions about the novel. That was the final exam, which of course she's assessing their memory and their ability to remember why Johnny ran away with that strange girl or whatever the hell happened with that novel. But it was like, yes, there has to be a reading on a reading test. So, but Eric, I guess I would advise keeping the skills kind of separate. Tahnee, what do you think?
Yeah, the whole time that you're talking there, I'm thinking here of the TOEFL, right? And their new integrated assessment, right?
Yeah.
And I like the idea, but you're completely right when you said, well, what you gain in authenticity, you lose in validity when it comes to assessing the language proficiency of the students, right? So, and I also, it reminded me of another quote that I read, I don't remember where, that said, another one that you have to address, right?
Wait.
So it's always finding that balance.
Tahnee,
but I do think that.
Tahnee, you froze for a second here, just when you were about to give us the quote. Can you tell us? Yeah, tell us the quote again, please.
In assessment, when you solve a problem, you end up creating another one. Yeah. And I think that's true. And then I think the key is finding the balance and going for validity, right? That's the most important thing. But then authenticity is also important, but how much do you gain? How much do you lose? I think this is a very important discussion to have and to keep in mind when you're creating assessments, right? And what is the purpose of your assessment? Are you actually teaching a university class in which you want to evaluate students on whether they were able to understand and learn the material and put it in writing? Or are you teaching the language in a language course and you're evaluating their ability to write and their ability to read? Right.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a very important discussion to have, and it's key to make sure that we are assessing what we want to assess. We're measuring what we want to measure. That's the end goal, right?
Yeah.
And I see that as a problem a lot with the tests that we review and everything, that you see that contamination of skill and teachers assessing things that they are not supposed to be assessing, well, when they're trying to assess another thing. So they're assessing one thing when they're trying to assess another. And so I think it's a very important discussion to have, for sure, in relation to assessment literacy.
Yeah, and Eric, I think it ties back to just that issue of being assessment literate also, because you're assessment literate and you can see there are issues, there are problems there, and that's why actually you even raised it. You're able to see that, okay, there's potential issues and potential problems there. So it sounds like you're asking the teachers some of the right questions about those things. Yeah.
Eddy, anything? I can add, I think the key thing about being assessment literate is being able to make good decisions.
Yeah.
And you can only make good decisions when you know, okay, I'm going to do this, but I know what issues come with it, or I'm going to do that, but I am aware of what I'm doing here. So you're doing things consciously as opposed to just, oh yeah, I think I'm assessing this, and when in fact you're assessing that, right? So you want to strive for that balance, like I said, with the authenticity and validity and reliability, but you want to be able to make sure that you're making informed decisions based on sound practices. Right?
Yeah. Yep. Great. Okay. What else? Other issues or questions? Go ahead, Jen.
I teach for a community college, ESOL, and I took on our lowest level class. So I haven't taught low level for about 10 years. It's online. We're not using an LMS on purpose because getting folks just to set their password, get their password for the LMS is a heavy hurdle right there with, the language barrier so big.
Yeah.
So I did
Jennifer, sorry to interrupt, but is it an integrated skills class? You're teaching multiple skills?
It is. So that complicates it, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hearing. Yeah. The book is an OER written by a colleague. It's 4 chapters. So I tested last night. I made a Google Forms test. Yeah. And I had, I just had them mostly unscramble some sentences using the be verb.
Right.
Hot is he is hot. Don't forget the period, capitalized first. And I think your webinar has helped me think about maybe adding some listening things. I could record myself, for example, with a multiple choice answer, maybe what they think. How are you? So I am fine would be. But if anybody has any tips or tricks for testing very low level folks who they can answer probably some basic questions about where they live, their age, marital status, do they work, but we're not much beyond that. That's kind of what I'm faced with this term.
Jennifer, do you have, I mean, how much control do you have over it? I mean, do you have lots of control over assessments and when you want to do them? And
Yes, I do.
And are there learning outcomes fixed for the course that you use? Not really.
Yeah. The next class is intermediate conversation or upper beginning, like reading, writing, grammar.
Yeah.
I honestly assess by having these little conversations at the beginning of class and just seeing if they reply to me. If I ask how was your weekend and they say I work at Safeway, there's something wrong there, Yeah.
Okay. Good. Jen, I mean, I'll let other people jump in, but I guess I would just quickly, if I was teaching that class, I guess I would try to separate the skills in terms of assessment, and maybe like, for example, one week I teach them some things about writing a simple paragraph or writing a few sentences about themselves, and then I would test writing, and then and then a following week maybe we get into reading and reading comprehension. We do some reading stuff, and so I guess that's what I would do. I would kind of break it up like that into spending a week maybe on some skills, and then I do an assessment about it. And if I have time, just go back and cycle through it again, maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Anybody else? Any ideas about assessing lower levels?
Michael?
I was actually waving to Eric's son, but I do have an idea because I just had a similar conversation with a colleague who's teaching. I don't teach lower levels, but I just had a conversation with a colleague who's teaching at the very beginning level. And what we're trying to do right now at my institution is update rubrics, or in some cases create rubrics where none exist. And the conversation, the point that I think you might be interested in here is that it really came down to, when we're talking about very low level writing, can we separate out construction of meaning, which is what writing is, from pure grammar? And can we really test anything except grammar constructions? So when we're testing at very low levels, can we really say we're testing writing, or is writing simply a kind of check on grammar? And I felt one way, and my colleague felt another way, and we didn't really resolve it. But I think that's a critical issue at very low levels. So I wonder what everyone else, it doesn't answer your question. It just kind of adds fuel to the fire. But
Michael is here to complicate questions, not necessarily to answer them. But no, it's a point very well made, Michael. Anybody?
When I was thinking about the assessment of lower proficiency students, I was also like thinking about the assessment or the quiz or the exam as a way of scaffolding. So if they are in that stage, so if I'm going to record myself doing any simple conversation, then I would give options and choices like A, B, C, because in that way, they are still a kind of trying to see the language behind or besides listening to the language. And if there is any way I can provide more pictures, more visuals into the quiz, into the assessment, in a way or another, that also to me is helping them. So there is a kind of a building in scaffolding with those options. But if it's a kind of almost the end of the semester or the term where I feel like I can kind of take that scaffolding with the options and just ask them about their weekend. So how was your weekend? And then in that way, they have already kind of practiced before with those options in that quiz or exam before, but now I'm taking the scaffolding to give them a kind of a nice push in to take simple risk.
That's a good idea, Abdul Samad. Yeah. And the picture idea too for lower levels. Go ahead, Perry, you're muted again, or not. No, you're fine, Perry.
I think you muted me. I think you did that purposely, just so I would have this trouble.
The utmost respect, Perry. That's all I have for you.
But Jennifer, I haven't taught a beginning ESL class for a few years. It was a few years ago. And I don't know that, I guess a few years ago when I was teaching a beginning class, ESL class, I would not teach reading and writing. So we taught audiolingually, and so we taught speaking and understanding. So I'm just wondering if this class is really a beginning class. And I'm thinking of assuming it takes 1,000 hours to learn a second language, or they're in the first 100 hours or the first 50 hours, why spend time on reading and writing at all at this stage? And let them get a feel and begin to feel comfortable with the language before you start teaching reading and writing. And I still believe, even to this day, that we don't know a lot about how to teach reading and writing. Some of you may disagree with me, but I have not met, I haven't seen any great successes, even with American students. I mean, native Americans who have, I mean, we have great difficulties teaching reading. And you know that if you have visited any American high school recently and looked at anything that they've written, they can't write. And I'm talking about Native Americans. So I know that's another problem, but I would probably just spend time on having fun with the language for the first 50 or 100 hours. That's just my feeling.
That's a good point also, Perry, and yeah, a good idea and a good way to keep them involved with the language. Mike, circling back to your questions, and Tahnee's going to jump in, but Mike, it sounds like the question was about whether you're able to distinguish between people's ability to actually convey meaning, or is all we're doing about grammar and sentence structure. That's what you're referring to, that dilemma there?
Yeah, and I feel that especially if we're testing grammar separately, that when we talk about writing at a low level, that we should be, this is just my feeling, is that we should really be trying to measuring their ability to express meaning, to express themselves meaningfully. Yeah. And of course, accuracy plays a role in that, but it's not simply, I don't believe in telling them they're taking a writing test and then, making them write 10 sentences and taking off a point for every error. That's not really a writing test, in my opinion. So,
but what about this? So is this a writing test, for example, for beginner, like Jennifer, this beginner level class, and she's been teaching them about, how to write good sentences, and maybe the next step is putting sentences together to write a paragraph. And then the paragraph, the test is, she gives them a test and it says, write a paragraph about your best friend. Isn't that, and that I'm a student and I'm writing about my best friend and I'm conveying meaning. I mean, isn't that, surely that seems to me an example of even students at very lower levels are able to convey meaning. This
Absolutely.
is my friend, this is my friend, this is why I like them, etc. Would you agree? Yeah. I mean, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Tahnee.
No, I didn't want to say anything. Gabriela raised her hand a while ago.
Sorry,
Her camera is off.
Okay. Hi, Gabby. Sorry, I missed the raised hand. Please jump in.
Hello. No, don't worry. Don't worry. Very interesting discussion. And well, I think I just have a comment. I think that.
Please.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. You're loud
okay.
and clear.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Teaching and assessing beginners is quite challenging, I think. And
Gabby, sorry, Gabby. Gabby,
Uh-huh.
can you remind us about your teaching context again?
I usually teach beginners as well.
Gabby's at a university in Honduras, and she's talked before about the challenge. She's talked before about the challenges of teaching large classes too. Sorry, Gabby. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, that's my context. We always have large classes. That's the biggest challenge. And in my case, I also teach beginners. And as Michael was saying, we have to be very careful because teachers tend to, well, I don't know if it happens to you, but it does to me, that we tend to correct everything, right? And it's okay to give feedback on everything, but we have to be careful what we are going to grade because there is a certain amount of mistakes, to put it that way, that are allowed for beginners. Yes. So for example, when they write a paragraph, and as you mentioned, for example, describing their friends, and we tend to correct everything and the use of prepositions, but we haven't studied prepositions, for example. And what Abdul Samad was saying about like training the students to take the tests or to solve those tests. For example, what I do, and it has worked for me, regarding speaking, right now that we are working virtually, I use the breakout rooms and I share my rubric, the one that I'm going to use to assess them. And I share it, and they have to use that rubric to peer assess each other. In my case, since I'm working with true beginners, the rubric is in Spanish, so they understand what is being assessed, okay? And they have questions, and after they have used the rubric, then they have questions to ask. If I only present the rubric, they won't have any questions. But when they use the rubric, okay, or we can use the L2, okay, the target language, but to keep it very simple, but at least to share the main criteria that we are assessing. That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
That's great, Gabby, and being able to use rubrics also as a teaching tool, and giving students some of the same rubrics we use with them and get them to evaluate a piece of writing or do something else. That's great practice too. Jen, before I forget, one other thing that I found useful for teaching very lower level students, this is in a writing class, is getting them to identify mistakes. Often they don't see mistakes, whether it's careless or whatever. So for example, I would go in and I write 5 sentences on the board. For example, he am happy. And I would ask them, and I would ask the students, how many mistakes do you see? And my sentences, the students are all over it looking for my mistakes, right? And they'll find some of them. And then I say, okay, now you do it. You write 5 sentences and I'll give them some topics. And I get them, start looking for your own mistakes. And they say, oh, not he am happy, and they'll fix it and change to is. So Jen, I was doing that. I would do that all semester. And literally it's just good writers are good editors, right? So if you get them to see mistakes, identify mistakes, errors, And part of our job is, and I just told my students, I said, you need to become better writers, and better writers make less mistakes. You just need to make less mistakes. And sometimes it's because they don't know the rule, but sometimes it's just being careless. And so spending some time on getting them to, identify errors and mistakes, I found that very useful.
Yeah, well, I've been doing that too. And it becomes kind of a fun game in the classroom, like you're saying. Yeah. Yep.
Good.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, great. We have a few minutes left. Any other issues or questions or concerns? Maybe I'll finish with a question. Is assessment literacy, is it important in your context? I mean, does your program, the people around you, pay attention to it? Are there trainings about it? Are there discussions about it? If I went to your program, your context, would I hear assessment literacy? Is assessment literacy an issue? Is it being discussed or anything? Abdul-Samad is shaking his head. No?
I think for me, talking about myself and my experience, I think it's more personal interest and trying to grow in this area, to learn more, to be a better teacher, better assessor. I think that's coming more on a personal interest and growth.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's the same with people here. But Abdul-Samad, how many people do you work with? How many colleagues are teaching with you in your program?
Now, like, we are down almost to 6 people.
Yeah.
And 5 full-time faculty, and it was me and someone as TAs.
Yeah, and it's a good point also about just the current conditions that we find ourselves in, and something like assessment literacy, sometimes it becomes less important when people are concerned about their jobs or classes or having students and stuff. So, yeah, okay. Mike, I mean, in your context, I know you do some work about assessment literacy and do some training and stuff. Is it something that your colleagues or people around you pay some attention to and see the importance of?
Well, I think there's really a range of experience and knowledge of assessment literacy in my program. But I do think one of the issues, and some people are very appreciative, but I do think one of the issues is that some people tend to be a bit territorial about their classes. Yeah. And they believe that they just sort of know instinctively how to test or what good tests are, and they really resist any sort of improvement of their tests, because it feels to them like an intrusion upon their personal space. So that's I found to be an issue sometimes.
Yeah, I found that to be an ongoing and continuous issue in my 9 years as an assessment coordinator. But I didn't realize it in the beginning, but I realized it later, Michael, is that assessment is tricky, because especially when you're dealing with people, because right on the flip side of assessment is the teaching, and what the teachers are doing with the teaching, and so by asking about assessment, it can also be very close to asking about teaching and their, to some degree, skills and ability as a teacher. So that's why that's where people can, of course, get defensive about those things. Yeah.
Well, you have to settle it on the basis that every teacher wants to be a better teacher. And this is assessment information that you gain from assessments will teach teachers a lot about how well they're doing, and will point them, if they're not doing well, can point them in a better direction. But they have to be very open-minded about it. They have to recognize that all of us can be better at what we're doing. If you think you are already there, then of course it's not going to do any good.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Perry, and definitely the teacher should be the learner in the classroom. But I guess like any profession, I mean, sometimes you also get people that are less concerned about students learning in the classroom, and if it happens, great. If it doesn't, that's their problem, kind of thing. And so yeah, that could be a bit of an issue too.
And that's also made me for like a second to think. I have always been evaluated on how well I teach in the class, but
Yeah.
I never remembered any kind of a small discussion or a conversation with the coordinator, just with the coordinator of the program about how am I assessing things in the class and out of the class. That
Yeah.
would have also sent me a message of the importance of assessment.
Yeah. Okay, great. And maybe a good point to conclude on, maybe, and I'll throw it back to Tahnee.
So, Eddy, thank you very much. I loved that we had this discussion moment here. With the previous webinars, I end up talking a lot, and so it was really nice to actually have a dedicated space for us to get together and then talk and discuss assessment literacy, which is part of everything that we've been talking about in all of the webinars since last year, right? So I think it was a good mid semester or end of the semester sort of webinar to do. And so for the next one on May 26th, we'll be talking about assessing pragmatics and about teaching pragmatics as well, because if you don't teach, then if it's not a topic that is usually brought up in the classroom, then how are we going to even talk about assessment, right, of pragmatics? And this, I have to say, pragmatics was my first passion in terms of research, and this is what I did my master's degree on, my master's thesis on, until I met Eddy and started working a lot with assessment a lot more. And so the next webinar will combine my two passions, pragmatics and assessment. So I hope to see you there. Same time, 1 o'clock on Wednesday, May 26th.
Okay, thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.